Um, okay. So I want to introduce first Mauricio Avendano, who's a professor and the head of Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College London. He's also an adjunct professor at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. And he has many, 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 many other affiliations, all of which I won't go into. But I'll also, Mauricio, maybe you could introduce Giacomo Passini, your co-author.
Yeah, sure. So welcome everyone, and really nice to be here. This paper is a collaboration, and one of my co-authors is here, Giacomo Passini. Giacomo is an economist. He's at Venice in Ca' Foscari University of Venice. And yeah, we've been sort of working for quite some time on the data set that we're going to present today. So yeah, I don't know, Giacomo, if you want to say something about yeah.
Okay, so, and Giacomo, do you want to say something?
No, thanks. Thanks again for the invitation. I'm happy to listen to Mauricio, and if needed, I'm here as well. So
that's great. Okay, these guys are on European time, so we should be gentle with them because they're in the evening. They've gone through a full day. So, and they're going to be talking about stress, happiness, and maternity leave at childbirth. So take it away. It's all yours, Mauricio and Giacomo.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Anne. I'm just gonna share my screen. Hopefully, hopefully you can see it now. Is that okay?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much for this invitation. This paper is, as I was saying, work that we've been doing with Giacomo together with Agar Prigiviani, also at Venice University, and together with Lisa Berman at Harvard University. It's a paper we've been working for quite some time, but actually we're still working on it. So I will really welcome any comments you may have. I apologize now that we talk about stress and maternity in advance if my daughters might jump in or make any noise. So forgive the noise that they're around. So let me get started a little bit with thinking about the motivation for this study. This study is very much motivated by the literature that many of you may be familiar with, looking at the impact that children have on parents' well-being, but also parents' mental health. Some of you may know this study from a couple of former colleagues of mine, Mikko Miksala and Rachel Margolis, who were interested in understanding the impact of having children on happiness. And I just we just picked up this graph, which summarizes a little bit the impact that this event in life, the moment in which childbirth takes place, on the reports of happiness. And it's quite interesting to see that, you know, for both men and women, there is this anticipation of birth leading up to an increase in happiness. And the moment of birth is kind of the top of that happiness before happiness declines. And you know, interestingly, it goes back to pre-birth level. So this is just an illustration that suggests that there is kind of a change in people's perception of their happiness around this sort of key event in life, which is the birth of a child. But we know that there is also, you know, maybe a little bit of a dark side, and I don't need to tell this to all of those of you who may be parents or may be familiar with the experience of parenthood in some ways, a dark side sort of associated with the experience of becoming a parent, and particularly with becoming a mother, is a much more well-studied sort of event. A huge literature, for example, looking at the impact on, you know, postpartum depression, you know, PTSD and anxiety disorders after depression. So these are kind of two different strands of literature that have, in a way, moved quite independently. One of them sort of is this literature on childbirth and mood disorders that link essentially childbirth to many different mood disorders around the perinatal period, including depression, post-traumatic stress, anxiety, and postpartum psychosis, for example. And the prevalence of these disorders is, you know, relatively high, sort of maybe 1 in 10 mothers experience postnatal depression, 70% anxiety disorders, and so it's quite a prevalent sort of set of issues that arise around childbirth. Now, at the same time, we have this literature looking at childbirth and happiness, and childbirth has been, as you all know, very much studied in the field of demography, and it's often described as one of the most rewarding events in adult life, a very important kind of cornerstone in the quest for adult well-being and happiness, if you like. And as the paper that I just sort of mentioned from Miko and Rachel, this idea that there is maybe an increase in happiness that happens around the birth of the first and the second child. The situation is a bit different for the third child, but this is kind of the general kind of framework. So these two literature suggest that there is something, let's say, potentially very positive about the experience of childbirth, but also these questions around the kind of impacts that it has on mood disorders. And so we were interested to sort of in reflecting a little bit more on this question of how do children and the experience of becoming a parent impact parents' well-being. And for this, I thought we could sort of go back a little bit to the kind of very basic literature looking at this question. And one of those theories that one sort of often comes up to is this kind of value of children theories. And this value of children theory suggests that children essentially bring well-being to parents through a kind of social production function in which sort of becoming a parent is associated with positive values such as self-esteem, a sense of achievement, and the strengthening family ties, and so on. So there's this kind of value of children literature that will suggest positive effects. Next to that literature, there is also sort of a strand that looks at the negative effects of becoming a mother, especially on well-being. And a lot of that literature you'd be familiar, that comes from economics, looking at employment outcomes, looking at work-family stress as well, and also job satisfaction, and suggesting kind of negative effects on these outcomes potentially. But also a literature that looks at the impact of becoming a mother on the relationship, marital relationships, financial distress, and also reduced leisure, for example. And again, there's this kind of other literature linking, mood disorders potentially to some biological mechanisms, for example, hormonal mechanisms leading to changes in neurotransmitters that increase, that may be kind of behind this postpartum depression, but also a psychosocial mechanism that may be more related to this kind of idea of role overload. Now, one of the issues that has been kind of quite studied next to the literature on the impact of becoming a parent and becoming a mother, which is what we're going to focus on, is the impact that paid maternity leave may have on this experience of having a new child. Some of you may be familiar, for example, with this paper that came out recently that was looking at the case of Norway and trying to look at the impact of a well-known reform in this field in Norway that increased maternity leave benefits around the 70s, showing sort of very positive effects on maternal health outcomes as well as other physical health outcomes. But apart from this study, there isn't actually much of a literature that will look at the impact of paid maternity leave on the physical and mental health of mothers around the period of childbirth. One of the interests that we have is to try to understand how this experience of childbirth and its impact on mental health may be in some ways moderated or affected by the policy context in which this takes place. Now, this just to say that this paper is very much inspired or a follow-up of a previous paper that we did also with Giacomo, Lisa, and Agar, in which we found essentially that mothers that experience a generous regime of maternity leave during the birth of their first child, and looking at their fertility histories in the second half of the 20th centuries, that had very long-term effects that could be observed on their levels of depressive symptoms already when they were age 50 and beyond. And part of what we're going to do in this paper is try to unpack a little bit what happened in between. So how does the impact of maternity leave, but also the experience of becoming a mother, actually impact on the mental health of these women at the time of the birth. Just to say, feel free to interrupt me or raise any questions. I'm very happy to answer them immediately. Okay, now, so just to sort of go a little bit into the question of what are the consequences of parental leave policy, and some of you may be familiar with this, but I thought, you know, we could sort of revisit some of this a little bit. You know, again, there is kind of a literature that's kind of quite mixed in some ways, suggesting that there may be positive effects of parental leave policies. You know, the motivation is very much focused on employment effects, increasing job continuity, the retention of skills, enhancing productivity, improving earnings, career advancements, and so on. But there's also sort of this idea that maternity leave or parental leave might actually also, you know, lower stress and have kind of health enhancing effects through a number of mechanisms that might involve interaction with the children, but also the impact of being able to, you know, to return to work later as a kind of stress reducing mechanism. But there may be also kind of negative effects of parental leave, if you like, sort of theoretically speaking. You know, there's all this literature sort of suggesting that long leaves may cause depreciation of human capital, for example, or have an impact on wages. They may, you know, maternity leave may also impact sort of mental health and well-being by postponing, if you like, the benefits of returning to work early, if you think that returning to work early might have also some positive effects. So in some ways, this is still sort of a question that needs to, in some ways, be addressed empirically to try to understand what the impact is of parental leave on actual mental health outcomes. Okay, so so a little bit with this background in mind, what we want to do in this paper is to try to test the hypothesis in a way that psychological distress as a result of the birth of a child may actually potentially coexist with positive emotions of fulfillment and happiness that happen around and in the aftermath of childbirth. So basically what we're interested about is to try to study whether basically life satisfaction and happiness, which in fact are in a different axis than mood disorders, right? So sometimes, you know, sometimes people think that happiness and, you know, emotional well-being or mood disorders are two sides of the same axis, but actually, you know, one can have high levels of happiness, but actually, you know, many different kinds of mood disorders. So we're going to look at this as two independent outcomes and trying to see whether this experience of happiness and mood disorders actually coexist during the period of childbirth. And we're then also interested in understanding how this might differ according to the kind of policy context in which the experience of birth takes place. There is quite an extensive literature looking at cross-country differences in the effect of childbirth on both mood disorders and happiness. And these studies that have looked at different countries, essentially, you know, they might reflect the, you know, the impact of culture, for example, or the impact of sort of social roles, changes of becoming a mother, but part of that effect may also reflect the impact of policies. And what we want to do in this study is to try to, in a way, try to isolate the impact of parental leave policies from all those other kind of cultural or social aspects that may explain why the experience of birth might be different across countries. So for this purpose, we're going to be looking at the impact of maternity leave policies on both stress and happiness, and in a way try to see whether these policies in a way kind of reduce the stress impact of childbirth, but also whether they might have any impact on the happiness effect, whether they may enhance the happiness effect associated with childbirth. Okay, so we're going to be using data from just trying to hide. Yeah, so we're going to be using for these a quite special data set, which is the survey of health, aging and retirement in Europe. This may seem unusual that we're using an aging survey to look at the impact of childbirth on mental health. But basically, the SHARELIFE study was a component within the survey of health, aging and retirement in Europe survey, which is very much a replica of the health and retirement survey, or a sister study of the health and retirement study in the US. And then, both Giacomo and myself and Agar have been involved since the beginning of this study, which started in 2004 and has been following up people aged 50 years and older every 2 years. And then in 2008, we collected data from what we call SHARELIFE, which are retrospective life histories. And essentially what we did was collect information on life histories of health, of employment, social conditions, but also fertility histories for all women and men that participated in this study. And then this is the data that we're going to use for this paper. So it's and I'm curious to hear your views about this approach. It's basically a study in which we're building up a panel out of these reproductive life histories that we could build out of the SHARELIFE data. The SHARELIFE retrospective life panel is then essentially an individual level data set that is organized as a sequence of life events, such as, for example, employment and unemployment spells, fertility, the birth periods, job characteristics, and so on. And all of these are kind of loops as episodes for each individual over the years, essentially from early life until the current age. So it's essentially a retrospective panel that reorganizes the data in such a way that each person in the sample contributes as many observations as there are years of age from birth until the age in which they are observed in the moment of interview. We're going to be focusing on countries that participated in the early waves of SHARE, sort of until 2008, which was the retrospective life history. And we're going to be sort of looking at around 12,700 women in 14 countries. And that means that we have, a little bit less than 500,000 kind of person years observations. Okay, so we have for each individual observations for every year, and we record this data as if we had observed every year of their lives on the dimensions that we have data for, including fertility, employment, and so on. Okay. Great. Sorry.
The obvious question is, which I assume you're going to get to, is how do you get reliable retrospective reports on all this subjective stuff? But I assume you're going to tell us.
Sure. No, that's a great question. I wasn't planning to tell you, but it's good that you asked that question. So, obviously, this is an issue for all retrospective life history data collection. Now, there's quite a big literature looking at the validity of retrospective life data. And generally what that literature suggests is that life history data, which uses this life grid in which participants put their main events around a grid in which they sort of locate when they took place, that these data collection methods are relatively accurate when you're collecting data of events that have quite a strong impact on their lives. Yeah, so events that were quite sharp and that had quite a lot of impact on their lives. That may be less precise to look at much more diluted sort of events in life, and there the studies that have compared retrospective panels with registry data have found less correspondence, sort of below 60%. But for the studies that have looked at things like births or periods of unemployment, the way this has been tested is by linking this data to registry data. Those studies, suggest quite a high level, and with that I mean not 100%, but above 80%, in which sort of the timing within a reasonable range of these events being captured. Now, having said that, and I think we can have that a little bit in the discussion. There's obviously this is not the same as having followed people over time, and that sort of that remains a limitation for this. Now, the reason why we're using SHARELIFE in a way is because we want to exploit, and I'll come to that, but we want to exploit the history of maternity leave benefits and policy reforms that have taken place. And there's essentially no other data that we could have used that would have gone back, all the way to the 1960s when these maternity leave policies were introduced that will enable us to look at this question. So maybe we can sort of go back to that question later, but yeah, so that's kind of our thinking. Okay, now, most papers are essentially looking at maternity leave. Most of these papers actually based on single maternity data sets. And then one of the advantages of using this retrospective data is that we can have data on completed fertility histories and also control for the total number of children, spaces within children, and parity, and so on. Now, the other reason why this is useful to look at this in this retrospective data is that the experience of childbirth is kind of a low frequency variable, right? So fertility, it lasts, say, maybe 25 years, maybe 30 years. But on average, there are around two once, if you like, per woman. So this is a rare event, and in a standard panel, it is likely to be too short the observation window to have sufficient variation. You could have this, for example, in the UK birth cohort studies that we use for other purposes, but then this is something that we only have for the UK. We wouldn't have this kind of variation across countries. So essentially, this is kind of one of the kind of the retrospective might be the limitation of this study, but also the uniqueness that it enables us to look at what happened over a very long period of time, looking back at different countries with different policies. So maybe, trying to sort of come back to this issue that what we try to capture is not a very detailed set of experiences across the entire life course, but really try to capture the timing of very serious events or events that people are likely to remember. What we did in the SHARELIFE data collection is that we asked people to report on several events in their lives, one of which is the experience of a stressful period in their lifetime. And the question that we asked, just to sort of make it clear, is that we asked people, looking back in your life, was there a distinct period during which you were under more stress compared to the rest of your life? And then we asked people to tell us when did this period start, in which year, and when did this period end? And essentially what we did, and this is basically our dependent variable, is to code, for that particular year in question, 0 if there was no period of stress, or 1 if there was an indicator for a period of stress. And this we do repeatedly in a panel fashion for each of the years, basically, from birth, if you like, until their age in which they participated in the study. So this is kind of the framework. Again, we can come back to what are the sort of biases that arise here. I'm happy to hear that your views on this, but this is kind of the way we look at this. And then we do the same looking at periods of happiness. Again, measuring happiness is a complex issue, huge issues looking at this. But what we're trying to capture here is asking people whether there was distinct periods during which they felt happier than during the rest of their lives, right? And sort of we ask people to tell us, when did this period start and when did this period stop? So in a way, this is again sort of capturing the single, most stressful and the single sort of happiest periods in a lifetime. And then again, we look at whether people, for each year, we sort of coded whether individuals experience in that year an episode of happiness or no episode of the most happiness in their lives. Now, in some of the analysis that I'm perhaps not going to go into much detail, in some analysis, we sort of look at the combination of these two events happening together, sort of whether both stress and happiness were happening in the same woman in a way. But we're gonna, the analysis that I'm gonna show you is sort of looking essentially at these two outcomes separately. Okay, if there are no questions until now, so maybe I can move on a little bit to look at what's our kind of main set of independent variables that we're interested here. So in a way, what we're interested to understand is how childbirth, the experience of childbirth relates to these retrospective reports of stressful periods and happiness periods. But we're also interested in the role of maternity leave. And for trying to capture this, we basically recorded in SHARE sort of several different types of job interruptions. These were measured basically as the number of weeks of job interruptions that happen around childbirth. And it's essentially coming out from this question. For every birth episode, we ask, did you temporarily or permanently stop working when the name of your child was born? And then you had a series of options to tell us whether there was an interruption or whether there was never a return to work and so on. If basically there was temporary interruptions, we then ask how long did you stop working for? And then we had a series of options. So, these are sort of categorical options: a month, 3 months, 6 months, and so on. And then sort of these ranges we ask actually ranges to ask people. So up to a month, then from a month to 3 months, 3 months to 6 months, and so on. And then we ask for sort of longer job interruptions. So this is the way in which we're trying to capture job interruptions on this data. Now, obviously, one of the concerns that arises, particularly with job interruptions, is measurement error. For example, when we ask people about their interruptions, maybe basically the no interruptions may be inflated due to the question wording. So, for example, if maternity leave in almost all countries was available since the 1960s, in some of these countries it was actually compulsory, and some women who took some time of leave but kept the same job may have actually said that they had no interruption, right? So people may have reported this as a no interruption. At the same time, leaves that took longer than 15 weeks are actually mechanically overestimated because of the way and the categories that we have available to record maternity leave or interruptions associated with birth. So, for example, we do not have the month in which the leave begins, nor the exact number of months for leaves that are longer than a year. And depending on when the leave actually started or when the birth happened, then we may actually, in some ways, overestimate the leave if it extended over three period years, but it actually lasts only 2 years because it started after June, for example. So there's quite a series of issues of measurement error that arise when we look at the length of job interruptions. So because of this, basically, we're going to use an instrumental variable approach to try to address this measurement error that I'm going to get to in a minute. But before that, let me sort of try to explain a little bit of what is it that we did in this paper. So essentially what we're going to do is quite a standard linear probability model where we use fixed effects, where we essentially model the probability of experiencing a stress period or a happiness period or both for a given individual at time t, which is at the year level. And we model that as a function of the experience of childbirth, which basically is a dummy for whether women had a child in year t in country C, plus lack and lead. So we have a dummy for the same before and after the year of birth. This is similar to what is done in other studies, such as the Mixilla and Margolis study. And then we have another variable, which is the job interruption variable that I just described, which is recorded as the weeks of leave at maternity. And these categories that you see here, so no interruption, and then 4, 12, 26, and 52 if it's happened within a year. And then it was 52 in year t plus 1 until year t plus 5. So we recorded 52 weeks and basically stopped recording after year 5 because we basically make the assumption that if the mother didn't return to work after 5 years, this was no longer an interruption, but was potentially sort of reflected sort of that the mother had left the labor market, assuming that the child at that age must usually start to go to school. So basically what we're modeling here is, modeling the probability of experiencing a period of stress or a period of happiness as a function of the timing of birth, controlling for a set of variables, including sort of what we call life cycle risk factors and health risk factors for stress. Part of the kind of what I find really kind of interesting about this life history data is that it's quite detailed. One thing is whether we believe the data as it is, but it's quite detailed in the set of questions that is asked. So we're able to basically tell whether individuals are single at every year, the number of children that they had in every year, and whether there were children below 6 years at the household, whether they were a lone mother by interacting these two things, whether their partner had died on that year, financial hardship, and whether they were dispossessed in every year. And then we also have information on a series of health, basically stress risk factors, if you like, including whether they had any period of illness due to gynecological problems, whether they had a miscarriage, and also whether they had diagnosis, including heart disease and stroke. So this is quite a, I suppose, quite a heavy panel in the sense that it has all this information that enable us to control for a lot of changes that may happen over the life cycle. Okay. So this is essentially, again, a fixed effects model, and perhaps hopefully you're familiar with that, what that means. But just to explain it, just in case, what we're trying to do here with fixed effect models is to try to control for all time invariable factors, and also control or sort of address measurement error, especially regarding job interruptions. Now, when I mean controlling for invariant and observables, what I mean there is that we're not comparing, for example, mothers who had a child and those who didn't, or those who had a child in Greece versus those who had a child in France. We're not doing that comparison, but we are comparing mothers to themselves and comparing the probability that a mother reports a period of happiness or a period of stress in a year in which they had a child versus a year in which they did not have a child, right? So basically this is maybe for those in public health, this would be something like a crossover design. So it's a fixed effects model in which we essentially control for constant invariant and observables. And then we use this also to control for measurement error. Now, thinking about the length of the interruption. So some of you may wonder, okay, so if we're going to look at the question of whether having a longer interruption reduces the risk of stress or increase the probability of reporting a happiness period, endogeneity remains a concern, right? So for example, women may decide the length of the interruption that they take associated with birth based on their levels of stress. So if there's a lot of stress, then they may take a longer interruption. So there may be reverse causality, for example. But also the measurement error is sort of an issue that may vary systematically with parity. So life in the first child is typically longer and therefore overestimated, but also further childbirths are typically shorter and maybe underestimated. Okay, so there's this issue that the reporting of the interruptions that women took by actually have substantial measurement error, and also the endogeneity concern around reverse causality. So what we do in this paper is use an instrumental variable approach in which we try to find a source of variation in the length of these interruptions that is presumably exogenous to the length of interruption variable. And what we do is to exploit variation in maternity leave, the length of maternity leave across time and across countries that are participating in the shared data. Now, this is something that has been sort of exploited before to look, for example, Christopher Ruhm have this famous kind of paper looking at the impact of the length of maternity leave on infant mortality. We're kind of following a similar approach using what is called the full wage weeks, which is basically the product of the weeks of paid leave that are available according to the law. And this is kind of with the product of the replacement rate, which is the average earnings that women are entitled to receive during the weeks of paid leave. Now, this is the main instrument that we use. We also use the log of family allowances, which comes from this GOTF database, which has collected the magnitude of family allowances in euros for the first child. And we use that also as a potential instrument to predict the length of the interruption. So I hope this is clear here. So basically the thought experiment here is that different women in different points in time in different countries are essentially exposed to different regimes in terms of the length of the paid leave that they can take, but also the generosity of the family allowances. And those two factors, which are, we are assuming are exogenous to them, are actually generating this kind of quasi-random variation in the length of the interruption that they take during childbirth. And this enables us to address this endogeneity concern, okay? Any questions on this? Okay, great. I hope you're still there because I can only see my slides. So if anybody will ask a question, I'll be very happy.
We're here.
Great, thank you. Okay, so just to give you a sense, maternity leave benefits, this may sound maybe quite a recent phenomenon for the United States, paid maternity leave. But actually, paid maternity leave was introduced in Europe in the post-war period. Most countries by the 1960s had introduced some kind of maternity leave that was paid. And actually, these maternity leave entitlements changed quite a lot over time for the countries in this study. So here I'm just listing some of the countries, and what you see in the y-axis is the number of weeks of maternity leave that women are entitled to. And then, so for example, if you take the case of, I suppose this is Denmark, I believe, in 1960s, the number of weeks was below 5, but then this increased sort of massively, moving towards the 1970s, and then it increased again, and then it decreased again, and so on. So there's quite a lot of variation within countries in the generosity, if you like to call it like that, of maternity leave benefits. Now, most of the women in SHARE who were 50 years and older in 2004 when they entered the study, most of these women would have had their children in some periods, around sort of 1960 to 1990, something around this period. And so they would have been sort of exposed to quite different regimes of maternity leave. The same is true if we look at the family allowances. These lines are a little bit messy, but I'm just showing us the kind of generosity in family allowances by country and how they also kind of vary over time. Now, obviously, there is a general phenomenon in which maybe you don't see it very clearly in this one graph here, but there is also a phenomenon of increased generosity overall on average. So, this means that we need to control for time trends in these models as well, and essentially exploit deviations from the overall time trends across countries. But yeah, so this
Mauricio,
is, yeah.
Can you say a little bit, I mean, you could talk at great length, but just a little bit about the kinds of policy issues which have led to which have led to these changes. I know a little bit about the Denmark situation, and that's the most striking one here. But when you look at your next graph also, occasionally there are huge annual, in the family allowances, huge annual changes, or, is it budget changes of government? What are the main drivers of this huge variation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Now, maybe first for the maternity leave, these reforms of maternity leave have a long history in the sense that they really started initially as a prohibition for mothers to work for the protection of the mother and the child. So it was initially a prohibition very much motivated by health concerns, but then eventually became basically a completely different mechanism to enable mothers to remain in the labor market, right? So that kind of process of transition, in the sense that maternity leave was no longer considered a kind of health policy, but actually a labor policy, that happened at different times in different countries. And that, I think, explains part of the reforms. Also sort of changes in governments and changes in, from social democrat governments to more conservative governments. So part of that also underlies some of these variations. Now, I must say, I'm not sure actually the family allowance variation in, those high peaks up and down where they come from. I think some of the changes will definitely come from changes in the political orientation, right? So again, changes from social democrats to conservative governments and so on. But I think some of these peaks might also reflect changes in prices. So I don't know if you, Giacomo, do you have a sense of what the variation is coming from?
No, I agree. Some of the variation is spurious. It comes from the fact that these allowances are expressed only in 2004 euros. So there is some price effect there. Okay, but clearly, anyway, the message here is also that here there is clearly a time trend, but there is quite some quite some variation around this time trend. Even if you try to smooth out or average out those peaks, okay, those policies do have quite some variation with the country. Okay, this is
Yeah,
what we exploit.
I'm just trying to think if there's any systematic variation that might affect your results, but it sounds like your conclusion is not.
Well, I don't. There is a like again a long-term time trend that goes towards more generous policies, at least up until the 2000s, and then there is a decline, and policies get stricter and stricter. What Mauricio was saying, that we control for a full set of year dummies. So and since we have fixed effect, we are basically controlling for country fixed effect. So the idea is that we are controlling for let's say the general way in which the welfare systems were going in those countries. So this is we are exploiting variation around that. So
Makes
we
sense.
should be safe in that sense. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I agree, but I think it's a good comment in the sense that some of these changes indeed might reflect changes in regimes that may have also coincided with other changes in the generosity of other policies. But again, because the timing of these policies was quite different across countries, and because those potential other policies that change along these other policies would have had to also be correlated then with the job interruption. So, a lot of things would have had to, as long as that other variation is kind of random across the different countries, I think this wouldn't bias our results.
Yeah.
But definitely it's a good point that they may reflect partly other results.
Shuchiji, do you have a comment?
I was going to ask similarly about the, just like, I guess the fixed effects should also then account for changes in like societal attitudes that may have, changed gender equality indexes or anything. Is that all accounted for in the same thing?
Yeah, great. Yeah, no, good question. Yeah, so I mean, in a way, the differences across countries in culture and other aspects are presumably captured by the country fixed effects, right? So your question maybe is then more about the changes in values, for example, and culture over time within countries. Now, we have year dummies, like that doesn't seem satisfactory, I'm sure, but that we have year dummies that basically control for things that have a trend over time, but we don't specify it as such, right? So we claim it here that those year dummies that we have are capturing these overall trends and changes in values. And now, obviously, we cannot have year dummies by country because that will become collinear with the variation in family allowance of maternity leave. So there, what we capture is kind of generally sort of, the trends that affected all countries simultaneously. And in some models, we make assumptions about linear trends, country-specific linear trends, but those are more difficult to interpret. So essentially, I think what we capture is any overall trend that basically affect all countries with these year dummies. I don't know if that kind of addresses it a little bit.
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, great. So now I don't want to spend too much time on this, partly because I confess that it's more complicated than I can understand it. But part of the issues that arise when you do this kind of analysis with a panel that is so long, where you have individuals, but many observations within individuals, is how do you cluster the standard errors? And in some ways, cluster needs to happen at the individual level. Partly because observations for the same individual are going to be strongly correlated. But then also we have this variation that happens at the country year level, right? Because that's the level of the unit of analysis for the policy variables, this kind of year country level. So we use this kind of double clustering that basically enables us to cluster both year by country clusters as well as individual clusters. We first cluster at the individual level and then at the year and country level. Now, if we were to just, for example, use individual clustering, so cluster at the individual level, the results are qualitatively very similar. So this doesn't change very much, but just to say that we use this kind of double clustering and that's available in this data. Okay, so maybe we can move to the results a little bit. And I'm going to first show you a couple of descriptives to give you a sense of what these variables sort of vary across countries and so on. And then And then I'm going to show you, one or two tables, which are really the main results of the paper. So this is a little bit of a busy slide, but this is showing us the descriptives for the periods of if we can call it like that, severe stress. So if you remember the question, looking back in your life, if there was a distinct period during which you were under more stress compared to the rest of your life. And then this is the incidence of stress periods by country, right? So where a period reported such a period. And, we see that this sort of varies quite a bit across countries, from just below 60%, let's say, for Sweden, and a bit of 60% for France, and then it is very low in Spain and Italy, right? So this is the incidence, and it varies quite a bit across the countries. Now, just one issue that you may wonder is sort of what is the distribution of the onset of these stress periods among women who reported a period of stress. And one of the concerns is that you might think, or you might be worried about some potential kind of skewness on these, this age of onset has been skewed, for example, towards recent periods, that people will tend to remember, for example, recent periods of stress, something related with maybe retirement or work and so on in later life and so on. But what it looks like here is that this distribution doesn't seem to be sort of skewed towards the sort of the onset of these periods. Doesn't seem to be skewed towards later ages. It needs to be, well, if more or less kind of evenly distributed across kind of the different ages around here in this period. And then the last kind of a slide is looking at the distribution of the length of the stress period among women, again, who experience a stress period. And then, yes, and then so this is the distribution of the length. And then what you see is that maybe the takeaway messages is that the majority of these stress period events are kind of relatively short periods, sort of a few years, with only a few people saying, reporting periods that lasted sort of, more than 10 years. So these are kind of, just to give you a sense of the kind of things, obviously people may be thinking about many different things when we ask them what's the most stressful period. But, the majority of the reports refer to things that happened, let's say, within 5 years or so. So, relatively short, I mean, in terms of years, relatively short periods. So this is the nature of the way people are reporting these, which I think is quite interesting in itself. But again, suggests that there is quite a lot of variation in the onset of these periods, suggesting that people are capturing different kinds of events across the life cycle, and also that it kind of varies quite a lot across the countries. Now, this is a question. Yeah, sure.
If I could, and that is, do you allow for the possibility that people have distinct periods of stress, more than one discrete period? Or how do you handle that in the survey?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Giacomo, do you want to say something about that? I mean, we don't, I think, is the answer. Do you want to say something?
No, I mean, the short answer is we don't, in the sense that what is asked is just about the most stress, was there a single distinct period in which you were under more stress compared to the rest of your life? So it's the question is comparative. This really, the way it's written is exactly, since it's a subjective question, to try to capture what is reasonable to capture in looking retrospectively to all your life. So the question was worded in this way. So we are able to highlight just one period, but it is supposed to be the most stressful period. So again, if it associates with a childbirth, rather than with other stressful event throughout the life cycle, it should be like a salient thing in one's lifetime. But okay, would be interesting to have a data set where you have several periods of stress and maybe to see whether they associated with each and every childbirth, but unfortunately we can't here.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks, Giacomo. Yeah. So exactly. So I think the question is important because it suggests that we're capturing basically situations in which childbirth was potentially the most stressful period that people remember in their lives, right? So this is kind of the top of the iceberg, if you like, to see it in terms of the stress distribution. Okay. Maybe some descriptives for the happiness variable. Again, looking at the same question. And this is the incidence of happiness, again, sort of lower incidence than period of stress, but also quite a bit of variation. I was surprised to see such a high value for France, and kind of quite puzzling why they have such a high incidence of periods of happiness. But maybe that's not so surprising. And then we have this distribution of the age of onset. Now, this distribution is, I would say, quite different from the distribution of periods of stress, which are kind of more evenly distributed. And these ones are kind of more concentrated around the 20s, the age of 20s. People sort of report the periods of happiness to happen more around the 20s. And then the distribution of the length of happiness is also quite different than that for periods of stress that you see here. Maybe less concentrated in a short duration, and sort of people reporting relatively longer periods of happiness than they reported periods of stress. Yes, I should have remembered what the mean is of these two things, but I can't recall exactly. Do you remember, Giacomo, what the mean of stress periods and happiness periods duration was?
No, honestly, I don't.
No, okay. No, that's fine. But they definitely sort of
definitely
longer for the happiness.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So just moving on to some descriptives on the job interruptions. Now, maybe this is not that useful, but just to show you kind of the question that was asked: did you temporarily or permanently stop working when your child was born? Now, as you can see, we have quite a large fraction of women that reported no interruption. And again, this was a period of time in which maternity leave was already available, and several of these countries it was compulsory. So this does suggest that there is a level of measurement error, in the sense that some women who may have actually taken some time for interrupting their work may have actually reported no interruption. And then this is the mean of the length of those interruptions, conditional on having had an interruption. Yes, so this is kind of just to show you that there's again quite a lot of variation across countries in the length of those interruptions that are quite difficult to interpret, since the probability of entering those episodes also varies.
Mauricio, one thing that may be relevant, since we do not have the scale here, and for maybe it's obvious for a European audience, maybe it's not for an American audience, those are years. So this is 1 year, okay? So on average across Europe, the length of interruption is above a year.
Very good. That's great. So I don't know what it would be in the US, the length of an interruption.
Much shorter, I guess.
Yeah, much shorter, I suppose. Okay, so yeah, so very long kind of interruptions in the context of these cohorts. Okay, so so maybe we can get to the results. So this is a slide that I hope it doesn't look too difficult to read. So these are the results of the main sort of models that we ran, looking at stress, which is on the left, and looking at happiness, which is on the right. So on the first column, we see the results of the fixed effect model, in which we look at the impact of, basically we can start here looking at the impact of the year of childbirth on the probability of reporting this as the most stressful period in your life. And what we see here is a positive effect. What this is suggesting essentially is that the year of childbirth is associated, if you like, with reporting the most stressful period, and you know that effect is an increase of around 0.5 percentage increase. Now the baseline probability of a stress period, I think it's around 10%. So you know this is a 0.5 percentage increase in that. Now we don't see an effect for the year prior to childbirth, but also see an effect for the year after childbirth. Now, when we look at the let me see. So at the the last, maybe we move maybe to the last column that shows the results of the instrumental variable fixed effect model, in which we instrument the job interruptions with the maternity leave. What we see here is essentially the impact of an additional week of job interruption on the probability of reposting this stress period. And what we find here, it's a negative coefficient. I realize it's quite difficult to interpret, but basically for every additional week of job interruption that is presumably exogenously produced by the longer maternity leave available, there is a reduction in the probability of reporting childbirth as the most stressful period in your life. Yeah, so this is basically, what this model is suggesting in the case of stress essentially is that the period of childbirth is, often associated then with a period of stress, but actually that's the weeks of maternity leave actually reduces the probability of this period as perceived as the most stressful period. Now, then we move to the results for happiness, and then what we find here is essentially that if you look at the second column, that the year of childbirth is actually is associated with an increase in the probability of reporting happiness periods, and this effect becomes larger when we move to the instrumental variable analysis with fixed effects. But essentially, we do not find any effect of the length, the weeks of job interruptions on happiness. Yeah, so we find a negative effect in the sense that more weeks of job interruption reduces basically the probability of a stressful period, but it doesn't change anything in terms of the experience of happiness or basically of the probability of reporting that year as a period of a special happiness relative to the rest of your life. Okay, so so I think, let me see, what else should we say here? Now, in some models, we looked directly at the impact of full wage weeks, sort of basically ignoring what people told us about the about how much of an interruption they had, and using the statutory full wage weeks that they were entitled for. And then what those results suggest is, again, that this is kind of a reduced form model in which basically, more weeks of full wage paid maternity leave weeks reduces the probability of stress, but has no impact on the probability of reporting a period of happiness. So what these results overall suggest, again, is that the period of childbirth is associated with stress. Also, the year after childbirth comes out significant. Also, it is associated with a period of happiness that remains in the year after childbirth, but that the weeks of maternity leave, primarily what they do is to reduce the probability of this period as being stressful without having any impact on the probability of reporting a happiness period. Now, this is not very important, but just to show you that the size of this coefficient, which is kind of difficult to interpret, 0.06, for example, for the impact of the childbirth year, it's actually comparable, if you liked, or maybe comparable to some other life events that are maybe better studied. For example, if you look at divorce, the probability of reporting a period of stress in relation to divorce, the coefficient is 0.12. That is about twice as the impact of childbirth. The impact of being dispossessed is 0.15. Just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the coefficient. So the impact is smaller than other events, but similar to some other events that sort of have been a little bit sort of better studies. Now, we don't see much going on, and this is just to show you that there isn't much. There aren't many stars yet, I suppose, but to show you that there isn't much that came up in relation to specific diagnosis. We didn't find much of a correlation between periods of stress and essentially the diagnosis and health outcomes, which suggests either that this panel retrospective data is maybe not very accurate to collect data on when this period started and when they ended. That's maybe a possibility, or that people do not associate those periods of those diseases as particularly stressful, a period in which they had asthma or diabetes. There might be other impacts, but not necessarily sort of stressful periods. So, just to summarize a little bit the results, is basically what these results suggest is that being in a childbirth year increases both the probability of reporting the most stressful period in life, but also the happiest period in life. Now, in some models, we basically created a variable that was one if the participant reported in that year both that year as being the most stressful, but also as being the happiest. And actually, we find sort of very similar results that essentially confirm that it is the same women who report both stress and happiness, which are driving these results. We also find that being pregnant, so looking at the lag values, increases the chances of reporting a happy period, but not, we don't find that it influences the probability of reporting a stressful period, okay? And I think most importantly, I think for these results, we find that, you know, the length of maternity leave essentially reduces the chances of reporting stress, but actually has no effect on happiness. Now, just, you know, I think I'm going to end soon here, but just to tell you that we've done a number of robustness checks, for example, looking at the job interruptions using a dummy just to say whether women stop working temporarily or not using the duration. We find very similar results that I don't want to sort of spend too much time on it, but sort of very similar results, for example, showing negative effects in the instrumental variable effects, so reducing stress. Then we also do analysis in which we focus only on mothers. In this sample, we're including all mothers because they can contribute data on other variables, even if they don't have children. But if we focus on mothers, we see very similar results. In some analysis, we look only at women that were born before, we look at women who were born before 1960 and drop those who enter as partners and had incomplete fertility histories. Again, this sort of had very little impact on the results. And also focusing on only women with no children before 1960, because the database on maternity leave only started after 1960. And again, you know, because most of those births in this cohort happened after that date, then we didn't find sort of much of a difference in the results. So this is just you know, the main kind of robustness checks that we carried out. So I think I'm going to kind of stop here, and, you know, just to sort of summarize a little bit. I think what this paper sort of brings is kind of this finding that childbirth is a key event in women's life. That's not surprising, but it suggests that it's a key event because it's a stressful period, but it's also a period that people often report as the period of most happiness in their lives. And then I think, you know, this confirms sort of this kind of two sides of the period of childbirth. Now, the second, I think, takeaway message is that experience, you know, that experience of childbirth, even though it may be also moderated by culture or by, you know, other kind of social, other factors in the social environment, we find that, you know, trying to absolutely isolate the impact of maternity leave, we find that maternity leave, it's an important kind of dimension of policy that affects particularly the experience of motherhood as a stressful period. I guess, you know, looking at this in a positive way, you would say, you know, being away from work doesn't necessarily harm well-being or happiness, if that's what we're measuring here. And, you know, we didn't find that, you know, the period of being away from work as a result of maternity leave will actually lead to, you know, a worsening in some ways of happiness. So I guess, you know, the no effect could be also interpreted as positive effect. So, you know, overall, we find, we take this evidence as suggesting kind of that they generally support maternity leave policies in the sense that they kind of reduce this stressful period around childbirth without any cost in terms of happiness and well-being. Yeah, I think I'll stop there, and yeah, just open it for you if you have any comments or questions.
Great, thank you. So what questions do we have?
I have a question.
Go for it.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you very much for sharing this work. It's very impressive to see this cross-country comparison, and I'd love to actually talk with you later, because I actually am conducting a similar work with cross-country aging studies. And so my first question is, you showed effect for the year before childbirth and after. What about the years? You know, because the first graph you showed, I think it was for it was like a very general description. You show this effect of happiness around the year of childbirth. but it didn't show us any. And maybe you did this as a robustness check for the like 2 years before, 3 years before, so that we could understand if the effect that we see is not something related to the age, to the age range that women have children, or if it's really related to childbirth itself. And also another question is, do you have data on women who have adopted? And if have you seen this? Like, is there any factor related to like the this particular body experience, or if it's related to the experience of raising a child? Do you look at this?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Brian, for this question. Just maybe answering the second question, we didn't look at adopted children. And as far as I recall, we don't have that information in SHARE, so we don't have the details for that. Giacomo, do you want to comment on the first question, maybe? On the, I mean, this is not something that we explore in the paper you write in the same way as the Mirsala and the paper.
Okay, as regards age's compounding effect, clearly we cannot control for age because we have year dummies and so on, but we have a quadratic in age that should again at least capture part of it. So this should not be an issue still. Okay, it's a well taken point to control for a wider window. We tried a little bit. The problem is that then you end up with a problem of since typically those women have more than one child, okay, in this age range, and the spacing between children is okay, typically 2, 3, 4 years. Then the windows overlap, so then it becomes a little bit more complicated to identify the effect, whether it is driven by since we have just one single period of stress, one single period of happiness, and we cannot really look at distinct period of happiness and stress during life. Then it becomes complicated to distinguish whether we're capturing one or the other. So whether we have to link the period to the first or second childbirth, just to say. So at the end of the day, we preferred as a specification to keep the window narrow around it. After all, we thought, okay, the year before is the year of pregnancy, so it's salient in that sense. The year after, okay, is the first year with the child around, so again, as a meaning itself. So was a compromise between what we can do, what we would like to do. So
I guess your question sort of makes me think that one thing we could do is to do some placebo tests, right? So try to see whether in other years, which were not childbirth years, but maybe randomly distributed, we see some kind of effects. We haven't done that, but I think we can do that sort of to try to explore whether it is really related to births. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Actually, just one more question, and this may be more of methodological curiosity, but is that possible to look at heterogeneity of this effect? Like, because I'm still not sure how we could do this given the multi-level nature of the model and the double clustering. But if we could just like predict probabilities and try to stratify the predictions by like by countries and by other variables to see if there may be some range of individuals who get no effect or even a negative effect.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, we definitely can look at different effects, for example, by, if you like, by educational attainment or something like that. That's technically possible. And technically, we could also look at different effects of the childbirth year, for example, by country. Now, we cannot do that for the interruption years because the variation that we're exploiting is actually variation across countries in the over time changes in the policy, right? So we would basically, if we take just one country, we would have that would be just collinear with time, right? So that's why we need multiple countries. But we definitely could look at each country. Now, the reason why you often don't do this in SHARE is because the sample size is just not big enough to look at country by country. So you get these sort of large standard errors. I mean, I think we did some of that in the beginning, but I don't think there was any sort of emerging pattern that was very clear. I don't know if Giacomo, do you remember anything more about the country variations or?
this is the case. I mean, you don't have clear patterns, and well, the reason is that once you go country by country, it's not that the sample is small, because reorganizing the sample in this way, you still have several thousands of person years. But remember that this is a panel of basically rare events. You don't have many childbirth. You do not have. You just have one stressful period, one happy period. So estimating things becomes complicated, because it's not the number of observation that you're buying going with multiple countries, but the heterogeneity on the variables we are interested into.
Right. Makes sense.
Thank you.
So I have a quick question. I think one of the real limitations of share, as you guys and also Don Tryman pointed out, was this idea of having one period, the most stressful period and the most happy period, because, you know, I just wonder if there's a little bit of bias in the response, because you can imagine somebody who has gone through having a child and a divorce and a job loss or losing a parent or something like that, and the three periods are very equally stressful. But what's the easiest one to answer? The easiest one to answer is probably when you had your first child. So I think I wouldn't discount the fact that that's a real limitation of the data, because I can imagine that you're missing actually some stress associated with having children, because people say seize on some other stressful event or some other happy event rather than talking about childbirth, because they can only have one. So I just be a little cautious about that.